This is Western Civilization 1. I'm Dr. Young, your instructor. We're going to continue our conversation today about the ancient Greeks. This video is dedicated specifically to the exploration of primary sources. Now, the Greeks left behind a lot of written evidence, a lot of material evidence, and we could probably spend an entire hour or more on each of these types of primary sources that I'm going to cover here. But I'm going to try to characterize, the Greek contribution and by pinpointing a few key sources, I think. Hopefully this will give us a good sense of everything the Greeks were able to accomplish, or at least some of the things they were able to accomplish. This discussion is going to run the full gamut of Greek history from the early Archaic Age through the Classical Age, and even a little bit beyond that. The Greeks were very prolific and very influential, and so it's important for us to comprehend the things they were able to do. I want to start with a discussion of Homer. I mentioned him in an earlier lecture. We don't know if there was such a person as Homer. He's a kind of a legendary figure. The texts, the two texts that are attributed to him, the Iliad and the Odyssey, almost certainly were not original to any single person in the 8th century. These were probably oral traditions that have been passed down for centuries by that point to be written down. And one of the things we have to realize about the Greeks is that they did not have, like the Judeo-Christian tradition, did not have a single religious work like the Bible or the Quran that was considered authoritative and told them everything they needed to know about God and things like that. Rather, they had collections of mythological stories that were living texts. That is, people in every century, every generation, elaborated on this mythology. The mythology concerned the gods, and really the alpha text for this was Homer. Homer was read all throughout Greek history. It was tremendously popular. People in ancient Greece almost certainly believed that Homer was a historical account of things that had happened in the great heroic age of the past. Greeks had a sense that the people who lived in the distant past were larger-than-life figures, maybe even of a different species of humanity, so to speak. Hesiod, for instance, talks about that. They were called heroes, and there were even kind of religious shrines set up to the veneration of the figures from the Trojan War. That's how important these figures were. And of course the gods, the Olympian gods, were worshipped in every Greek city. Every Greek polis had its own patron god or goddess, and probably other temples as well. They believed the gods lived on Mount Olympus. They believed the gods were immortal, that they were in their true form, 100 feet tall and glorious beyond all description, but that they could disguise themselves as human beings to meddle in human affairs. Of all of the things that we can learn from Homer, and there's a great deal that we can learn about the Greek ethos, about the Greek sensibilities, Greek attitudes from reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, but the one I want to focus on is the kind of their view of the gods, right? In Book 1 of the Odyssey, Athena comes to Zeus, and Athena is, of course, the goddess of wisdom, also the goddess of war and strategy. She is Zeus's daughter, and there was, according to the mythology, no mother. She sprang forth fully formed from the head of Zeus. And so father and daughter have this kind of close relationship, at least that's how the text kind of characterizes it. And Athena does her best teenage daughter impression. I know this because I have a couple of teenage daughters, so this makes sense to me. And says, essentially, "Daddy, why do you hate my friend? Why don't you like this guy?" And she's talking about Odysseus. Now, if you don't know the story of the Odyssey, Odysseus is a great Greek warrior. He is the basileus of the city of Ithaca on the Adriatic coast of Greece. And he, following the leadership of Agamemnon, went to Troy to fight against the Trojans to recapture Helen. Helen, who was sort of kidnapped. She was the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and Agamemnon's brother. And she was spirited away by Aphrodite to be the wife of Paris, the prince of Troy, and they fight this war over. We never get the full story of the Trojan War in any single text. Even the Iliad is only one kind of anecdote from the Trojan War that takes place near the end of the war, but there's no synoptical account, so to speak, of the entire Trojan War. The Odyssey takes place after the war. For 10 years, Odysseus is lost at sea. He cannot get home because he did something to anger Poseidon. Poseidon, of course, the sea god, the brother of Zeus. Poseidon was the father of the Cyclops, and Odysseus, when he sailed past the Cyclops island, stopped there, and the Cyclops imprisoned him and his men in a cave and started to eat them, and Odysseus then, using his craftiness, blinds the Cyclops and is about to get away, but then in a fit of hubris, and hubris is a very important Greek concept, means like a false overconfidence or an arrogance. The Greeks found this reprehensible. He shouts out his name to the Cyclops, and the Cyclops then prays to his father, to Poseidon, and asks him to punish Odysseus. And Poseidon does this by preventing Odysseus from getting home. He, takes him out to sea, and Odysseus ends up enduring all of these trials. Poseidon doesn't kill him, but he makes it so that he cannot get home. And Odysseus is pining. He's desiring to get home. And so that's where we kind of start the work. And we get some of that other stuff in flashback partway through the Odyssey. But Athena comes to Zeus and says, "Why can't you help my friend?" Now, the question we should ask here is, why does Athena care about Odysseus? And we can look at other examples in Greek mythology to see instances where gods cared about specific human beings. And we can, sorry for the yawn, conclude from that in most cases, the gods take an interest in human beings when they are in love, or in lust, rather, with them, or when they have sort of the results of lust, when they have born children or fathered children by a mortal, and now have an interest in their offspring. Well, the interesting thing about, or the unique thing about the relationship between Athena and Odysseus is it is neither sexual nor maternal. Athena is an asexual goddess. There are really no instances in the mythology of her being even interested in sex, taking any interest in sexual relations at all. And so that's not what's going on. And she is not related at all to Odysseus. He is not her child, unlike Aphrodite and Aeneas, for instance, or some of these other instances of divine beings bearing half-mortal children. So the answer to that really lies in the character of Odysseus. He is not only a great warrior. In fact, he's not the greatest warrior. Achilles probably has that title. He's a great warrior, but he's not, he doesn't stand out above other great heroes necessarily. It's that he is a brilliant mind. He is the greatest strategist in the Greek army. In fact, he is the one who came up with the plan to build a large wooden horse and secrete the Greek Senate, and that's the way that they defeated Troy, of course. Odysseus is the one who figured all of that out. And so Odysseus is, in a way, not just in one way, in many ways, the mortal counterpart of Athena. She is the goddess of war and of wisdom, of cunning, of strategy. And Odysseus combines those things in a mortal. And so Athena wants to help him. She is his personal patron goddess. So that's why she goes to Zeus. Now, the response of Zeus is telling of beliefs that the Greeks had in their gods. Zeus says, "My child, what are you talking about? How can I forget Odysseus, than whom there is no more capable man on earth, nor more liberal in his offerings to the immortal gods that live in heaven?" So, of course I want to help him, he says to his daughter, right? But Zeus is limited in what he can do, or rather he's unwilling to just step in and intervene directly, because as he says, bear in mind that Poseidon is still furious with Odysseus for having blinded an eye, the only eye, of course, of Polyphemus, king of the Cyclops, and Polyphemus is Poseidon's son, and therefore, though he will not kill Odysseus outright, he torments him by preventing him from getting home. So what does this tell us about the Greek gods? Well, pretty clearly that although they are immortal and have tremendous power, they are not necessarily all-powerful. And specifically, they have their own realms. They don't, and they're reluctant to interfere in each other's affairs. Odysseus is traveling on the sea. Poseidon is the god of the sea. Zeus is the god of the sky and of weather. He wields the lightning bolt, of course. And he could pull rank on Poseidon and probably, venture into Poseidon's realm and try to do something directly, but the likely result of that is going to be conflict. And Zeus always comes off in the mythology as a kind of peacemaker, somebody who, is where, an instance where cooler heads prevail. The other gods tend to be more capricious and ready to fly off the handle, and Zeus tries to calm things down. So that's just the character of Zeus. And so he doesn't want to intervene directly. But he then says to Athena, "Let us lay our heads together and see how we can help him to return. Poseidon will then be pacified, for if we are all of a mind, he can hardly stand out against us." Zeus is a manager. Okay, he's got to figure out how to form a team here, so that they can, kind of an intervention with Poseidon, as it were, so they can, so it doesn't just look like Zeus is doing this unilaterally, right? That tells us a lot about the gods. Okay, now Athena's response is similarly interesting. "Father, son of Kronos, king of kings, if then the gods now mean that Odysseus should get home," and so this is, again, sort of classic teenage daughter. He gives her a little bit of an opening, and she, sticks her foot in there and bursts it wide open. She's like, "Okay, this is what we're going to do. So send Hermes, the messenger god, to Calypso." Calypso is this minor goddess who has Odysseus imprisoned on her island because she's in love with him. Tell Calypso to let him go, and I'm going to go to Ithaca and help out Odysseus' son Telemachus. Telemachus has come of age. He's like 20 years old at this point, and the suitors of his mother Penelope, thinking that Odysseus is dead, want to marry her because if they do, they can fill the position that Odysseus left, which is the position of Basileus, the ruler of the city of Ithaca. Of course, Telemachus should inherit that, but he's still a young lad. And so Athena is going to go and help him. Now, what this tells us about the gods is that, the Greeks believed that they occasionally, at least, intervened directly in people's lives, that they meddled for their own purposes. In this case, Athena wants to help Odysseus. Odysseus is her favorite. It's kind of like the teacher's pet. And so she's going to do anything she can to help him out. And she's trying to get Zeus and others on her side, right? Now, the question, the really big question, and one that scholars have tried to grapple with, is why do or why did the Greeks believe in and worship gods who were in some ways limited, who were moody, who were capricious, who were subject to flights of fancy and anger and jealousy and lust and these other things? If, as it says in the Hebrew Bible, man was created in the image of God, for the Greeks, the gods were very much created in the image of man, or humanity, to use gender-neutral language there. They had, human frailties. They were subject to human emotions and other things. And a lot of scholars have tried to answer this. One of the best studies that I have read, and one I assign in upper division classes, the book called Greek Gods, Human Lives by Mary Lefkowitz, suggests or proposes that it's because the gods represented for the Greeks the ultimate in human existence. They lived in the nicest place, they ate the best food, they didn't have to worry about sickness and disease, and yet they were relatable because they were subject to these very human frailties. So they were, the Greeks were concerned very much with human existence, much more than any sort of supernatural realm, and the gods were indicative of that. Okay, now, like I said, there's a lot of other lessons that we could draw out of the Odyssey, even from the assigned book 1 of the Odyssey, but I think we'll leave it at that. If you do want to discuss anything else, feel free to bring it up on the discussion board. Okay. Now, a second genre of literature. So Homer is the great writer of epic poetry. And epic poetry would remain an important genre all through Greek history and would influence later layers of Western civilization. The Romans wrote epic poetry. Epic poetry was common in the Middle Ages, as we'll discuss later in the course, and so they were influential that way. Another genre of literature that the Greeks kind of invented for the West was the genre of history. Now, I'm going to move to a web browser here to look at the assigned reading from Thucydides. The two great Greek historians, and they were not the only Greek historians, there were Greek historians who wrote for several centuries, but really kind of the founders of Western historical thinking were Herodotus, who wrote a history of the Persian Wars, and Thucydides, who wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides was an Athenian who was early in the war a general in the Athenian army. He then sort of fell out of favor with the Athenians and had to resign and withdraw, and he ended up writing a history of the war. This was never completed. It seems Thucydides died before the war was over, and he never got a chance to finish it. Now, there are a lot of things we could say about the genre of history here, and draw out examples from Thucydides. But above all other things, the Greeks were the originators of history as ethics. That is, the process or the activity of drawing lessons from history, applying the lessons of history, as it were. And when I gave the course overview lecture, I talked about this a little bit. That we can draw lessons from history. Those who don't learn the mistakes of the past are condemned to repeat them, and all of those old adages, right? Well, that kind of thinking really originates with the Greeks. History as social commentary. History as, as a set of lessons to be learned by humanity, so that they are not doomed or condemned to repeat them. And in this assigned section of Thucydides, which is my favorite section from the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides treats the situation early in the war of a city called Corcyra. Corcyra is on an island in the Adriatic, just off the coast of western coast of Greece. And as various poleis were lining up either on the side of the Spartans or the side of the Athenians, Corcyra felt a great deal of pressure to join one side or the other. There were some who argued that they should remain neutral, but there was a camp of kind of a pro-Spartan camp and a pro-Athenian camp in Corcyra, and this ended up producing a kind of civil war in the city of Corcyra. Okay. Now, as Thucydides was describing all of this, he drew out some lessons, or rather provides a kind of social commentary on this. And I want to just look at a little bit of this. Let's see. The part that I wanted to talk about here starts with the number 4. So about this section here. Okay. So Thucydides points out that in the midst of all of this conflict, as people were arguing for one course of action or another, they began to castigate their enemies or rather their rivals as enemies. People altered at their pleasure, I'm reading here, the customary significance of words to suit their deeds. And so they began to alter their language in the midst of this conflict, such that, to quote here, irrational daring came to be considered the manly courage of one loyal to his party. So something that would have been, vilified or at least frowned upon before this situation now became a virtue, right? They turned a vice into a virtue. Prudent delay, that is, let's wait and see what happens here before we make a decision, was thought a fair-seeming cowardice. A moderate attitude was deemed a mere shield for a lack of virility. Right, so nobody could be neutral or moderate because that was considered cowardice, or a lack of manliness. A reasoned understanding with regard to all sides of an issue meant that one was indolent and of no use for anything. Rash enthusiasm for one's cause was deemed the part of a true man. To attempt to employ reason in plotting a safe course of action, a specious excuse for desertion. One who displayed violent anger was eternally faithful, whereas any who spoke against such a person was viewed with suspicion. One who laid a scheme and was successful was wise, while anyone who suspected and ferreted out such a plot beforehand was considered still cleverer. Any who planned beforehand in order that no such measure should be necessary was a subverter of the party and accused of being intimidated by the opposition. Right. So in the midst of this conflict, things like prudence and moderation were considered vices, were considered evils, and only rash enthusiasm and irrational daring and things like this were celebrated. And Corcyra just lapsed deeper and deeper into this conflict and ended up involved in a bloody civil war. Okay. So Thucydides is trying to kind of point out here some flaws in human nature, or flaws in human action. And that's the purpose of history as Thucydides and other Greek historians envisioned it. And that view of history is tremendously influential. Just about every major historical writer of the history of Western civilization, up until fairly recent times, at least the last couple hundred years, wrote history with this in mind. History as ethics, history as social commentary, history as drawing moral lessons. And it still remains part of what historians do. So we owe Thucydides a great debt for all of that, I think. And again, if you have questions or want to make comments about this source, please do so on the discussion board. I'd love to see and participate in some discussion there. All right. Now, the next genre of literature or cultural contribution that I want to discuss, and this gets at the heart of your first major paper, is drama. In Athens, in particular, in the 5th century, drama served a very important social purpose. At the Dionysian festival, which I discussed in an earlier lecture, so I don't want to belabor that point, but this was held annually. It was a celebration, veneration of the god Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, and this featured these competitions between playwrights. Each playwright was to produce a certain number of tragedies and comedies, kind of a whole program of things, and these would be performed. The entire citizen body of Athens was supposed to attend this. And so these were incredibly well attended. The city officials, in fact, there were magistrates elected specifically for the purpose of organizing the Dionysian festival in this competition of dramatists. And so this was a very important institution in Athens in the 5th century. And it was, the leaders of the city, the ecclesia, insisted on making this a big deal because, for them this was a time for Athenians to reflect upon their citizenship and to kind of do their patriotic duty for Athens, to to understand the issues of the day and things like this. So tremendously important institution. So we talked about the purposes here. Okay. We unfortunately do not have a lot of surviving plays. Only a handful, and only from 4 playwrights. 3 tragedians, that is, writers of tragedy, and 1 comedian, that is, a writer of comedy. Now, it's likely that, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides probably wrote comedy as well as tragedy, but none of their comedies survive, and Aristophanes may have written some tragedy too, but only his comedies survive. So, and there are other names mentioned in the records, but we do not have extant plays from any of them. We only have them from Aeschylus, pictured here, Sophocles here, Euripides here, and Aristophanes here. Now, it would be impossible for me to sort of characterize in short terms here the messages of these plays, but I do want to talk about the one that's assigned, which is the Trojan Women. Each play is unique. Each play confronts the issues of the day. They're different issues, and even a single playwright can adopt a kind of different character in one play versus another. Tragedy gets at the social issues by, exploring the problems of hubris, false overconfidence, exploring the problems of not doing one's duty as a citizen, essentially the consequences of not respecting the gods, not being a good citizen, giving into or participating in things that were considered reprehensible. And, the consequences are usually very severe. The gods do not smile upon these kinds of actions, even if they're done perhaps with the best intent, right? This Greek tragedy often sort of traps the viewer in a world where the main characters can do absolutely nothing to escape the wrath of the gods or the retribution of the gods. A good case in point would be the character Oedipus in Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex, who was exposed, left out to die, essentially, by his parents because the blind prophet Tiresias proclaimed that the king of Thebes would and his wife would bear a son who would later kill the father and marry the mother. And so, when they're going to have this son, Oedipus, and they're like, well, we can't keep this kid around. We've got to kill him. So they leave him out exposed, as Greeks did occasionally to their children who were unwanted, so that he would die. But a shepherd comes by and saves him. He eventually makes it to Corinth and gets adopted, kind of, by the king and queen of Corinth. And then Tiresias shows up in Corinth and proclaims the same prophecy to Oedipus, that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Oedipus, thinking that his father and mother are the king and queen of Corinth, leaves Corinth. And as he's on the road, he's headed toward Thebes. He doesn't realize he's really from Thebes. And he meets up with this guy who he gets into an argument with, and he kills him. Now that turns out that it's his father. Then he goes and rescues the city of Thebes from the threat of this magical creature called the Sphinx. As reward for his heroic deeds, the now widowed queen marries him. Well, that, of course, is his biological mother. And Oedipus doesn't realize any of this, and he's a very commendable character, but he's trying to flee his fate. He's trying to do something to contravene the will of the gods, and instead he just runs right into his fate. And once he realizes this, he becomes horribly depressed and gouges out his eyeballs with pins, or a pin from his clasp that holds his cloak on. And it's a terrible tragedy. Terrible things happen to Oedipus, really, through no direct fault of his own. And these things were designed to make these Greek audiences squirm a little, I think. Now, Trojan Women is one of the more obvious tragedies of the whole canon of tragedies, because we can locate the context fairly readily. This was written right in the middle of the Peloponnesian War by Euripides, and he's commenting on two things specifically. So as you read that play and prepare to write the paper, you should consider this context. First of all, in the year 416, Athens besieged the polis called Melos. Now, in the last lecture, I realized that I erred. I made a mistake in saying that Athens had, in the midst of the Peloponnesian War, attacked the polis of Thasos and killed most of the citizens and sold the rest who were still alive into slavery. I had that mixed up. Athens had attacked Thasos in an earlier period to force them to become part of the Delian League. It was actually the polis of Melos, so apologies, you need to go back and fix your notes there. But that's what they did to Melos. Melos was trying to remain neutral in the war, and Athens insisted that they join the Athenian side. They were in a strategically important location. And Melos was also rich, and so Athens wanted their monetary support in the war. And when Melos refused, Athens laid siege and eventually took the city and killed most of the male population and sold the women and children and elderly into slavery. And really, Melos ceased to exist as a polis, right? Now, that was when Athens was feeling pretty good about their prospects in the war, but shortly after this, Athens took their army and invaded Sicily. Now, you might wonder, what are they doing in Sicily? Well, there were lots of Greek cities in Sicily, and some of these were allied with the Spartans. The city of Syracuse, in particular, which was a very large city on Sicily. And so the Sicilian campaign was the key kind of middle phase of the war. And Athens ended up being defeated soundly. In fact, they lost an entire huge army in Sicily that was just destroyed completely. And really, after their defeat in Sicily, Athens had no real hope of winning the war outright. They still, were trying to provoke a stalemate and force some sort of settlement with Sparta, but their hopes of winning the war outright really faded after their defeat in Sicily. So Euripides was writing in the midst of all of this stuff that was going on, and he saw that the tide of the war was starting to turn against Athens, and he worried a little bit about what they had done, more than a little bit, I think, at what they had done at Melos. Now, in the Trojan Women, of course, we have the story of the aftermath of the sack of Troy. The Greeks have taken the horse, or rather they have burst out of the horse and defeated the Trojan warriors. King Priam has been killed and sort of left out, exposed to the elements, not buried by the Greeks. And his wife Hecuba and their daughter Cassandra and their daughter-in-law Andromache, sorry, the name slipped me for a second there, and their grandson Astyanax. Andromache, of course, the wife of Hector, the great warrior who was killed by Achilles, the story we hear in the Iliad, and Astyanax, his son, and so their fate remains in the hands of their Greek captors at this point, right? And the chorus is made up of women as well, who sort of comment on what's going on, capture the innermost fears and thoughts of these women. Now, there's a reason that Euripides chose that subject matter. The mythology of the Trojan War was familiar to everyone. There wasn't a person in Athens, probably, who did not know the story of the Trojan War forward and backward, who were not accustomed to this. I mean, this would be like, I don't know, referring to, even more perhaps than referring to, say, the Marvel Cinematic Universe today or something like that. Everybody knows who Captain America is and Iron Man and all of that, right? And so, that's why he chooses this. It's a good ground for exploring some pretty difficult questions, right? So the mythology is familiar, but the treatment of it is new. Seeing the consequences of the Trojan War through the eyes of the women was a provocative step for Euripides to take. Because women were supposed to be denigrated to a private role. Their space that they occupied, so to speak, was the private sphere, the household. And yet Euripides brings them front and center and makes their concerns the main concerns of the play. And a choice like that would have been provocative. This wasn't something that the Athenian populace attending the Dionysian festival would have been accustomed to necessarily. It should be said that Euripides was not the only one to make a decision like this. In the third play in the Oedipus cycle, the play Antigone, the main character is a woman. She's the daughter of Oedipus, who is trying to somehow salvage something good out of the wreck that her family has become due to the incest and the fratricide and other things that have happened in that family, right? So Euripides is not entirely original here, but in essence, he's taking something that is very familiar and tweaking it to make a point. Well, the question is then, what are his concerns? Or rather, what sorts of concerns is he drawing out here? I think one obvious one, and I'm going to leave most of this to you, right? You need to read this and to look at the prompt, which asks you to read this in context and decide what the main concerns of Euripides were and why he was so concerned about these things. And so that, this is open to your interpretation. But you have to acknowledge the fear that Euripides seems to evince here, that the Athenians are going to, to put it with a cliche here, to reap what they sow. They had done terrible things to the people of Melos, whom they had defeated. If the Athenians were to be defeated in the war, would their women and children end up like the women and children of Troy? Sold into slavery, claimed as war prizes by the key soldiers in the enemy army. Euripides does some surprising things in a number of instances in that play. The character Odysseus, for instance, who was so admired in the Odyssey, who was considered by so many Greeks to be, the epitome of what it meant to be a Greek warrior, does not come across well in the Trojan women. He is seen as the most vile of all of the Greek soldiers, right? And so Euripides may be saying there, the things that we are holding up as virtues might be perceived as vices, and vice versa, right? In a way, he's providing the same kind of commentary that Thucydides did in the Civil War in Corcyra, evincing these fears of what happens when people are placed at extremes, right? So consider all of that as you prepare to write this paper. And if you have questions, please bring them up on a discussion board. Feel free to email me personally as well. That's fine. This is your chance to really do some analysis and arrive at some opinions about what this all means. Okay, the last genre of literature, or or cultural endeavor that I want to discuss in this video is Greek philosophy, and we would be terribly remiss if we did not do this. Of all of the contributions the Greeks have made to Western civilization, arguably philosophy is the most important, the most long-lasting, the most influential. We should try to define the term philosophy. This is a Greek word. The prefix philo means love, and the Greek word sophos means wisdom, and so philosophy simply means love of wisdom. It's a nondescript term, in other words. And ancient Greek philosophers delved into lots of different topics, all in an effort to simply understand the way things are, how things work. Okay, to understand reality, to understand the essence of being, to understand what constitutes reality. Now, this begins with philosophers in the archaic period. At least those are the earliest extant texts that we have, and scholars have lumped all of these figures together into this broader category called the pre-Socratics, because they come before Socrates. That's not to say that they would have called themselves that. Of course, they didn't realize that there was a guy named Socrates who was going to come along and be more famous than they were. For the most part, and I'm really generalizing here, the pre-Socratics were concerned with the question of physical matter. What makes up the universe? They elaborated on the idea, which was common in ancient Greece, that all of the world is made up of four basic elements: earth, air, water, and fire, and that the behavior or the physical phenomena that we witness are the results of the interaction. Sorry again for the yawn. The interaction between these different elements. Now, some of the pre-Socratics did explore other questions, and even some of them, in looking at physical matter, moved beyond the four-element theory. In fact, the philosopher Democritus, for instance, came up with the notion that the world was made up of these tiny indivisible building blocks called atoms, and that atom, in fact, is a Greek word. He put that theory out there. It was not widely accepted, but it was already in play, even in the 6th century BCE. Now, the three most important philosophers, the ones pictured here, are Socrates up here in the upper left, Plato pictured here in statue, and Aristotle down here. Okay. Socrates represents an important break in the pursuit of philosophy, because rather than be primarily concerned with physical matter, though he seems to have delved into those kinds of questions as well from time to time, Socrates was most concerned with questions of ethics. That is, questions of proper behavior, good and bad, the definition of justice and things like that, right? In doing so, he often commented on and was very critical of politics. Socrates lived in Athens, but was not terribly friendly to democracy. And as a result of that, he made a lot of enemies. He was not a popular guy in Athens. He was, in fact, kind of annoying to a lot of people because he, in engaging people in conversation, tried to force them to defend their opinions, and he tended to ask questions that they couldn't answer. And so Socrates is the kind of guy who, when you see him coming, you try to hide or run the other way or quickly find an excuse not to be there. So he wasn't very popular. He got caught up in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War. Even though he fought during the war, it seems quite valiantly, in defense of Athens. In the aftermath of the war, with the whole mess of the 30 tyrants and the restoration of democracy, there was a kind of witch hunt for enemies of Athens, and Socrates fell prey to that. He was put on trial for corrupting the youth of Athens, and what that really means is kind of teaching people to question democracy, to question the government. And in this this atmosphere of suspicion, that was a real problem. And so he was put on trial and put to death in the year 399 BCE. Socrates never wrote anything down. In fact, he was skeptical of writing in general. He said people ought to remember things if they're important. But he did have a lot of pupils, or rather followers. Socrates probably wouldn't have claimed ever that he was a teacher. In fact, he denied that quite vehemently. But he did have followers who picked up on his lead and continued with his philosophical inquiry. The most important of these, though far from the only one, was Plato. Plato opened a school, in fact, in Athens called the Academy, where he engaged young pupils in conversation. Plato and the Academy made its money really by teaching people how to speak well. Remember, public speaking, oratory was the most important skill in Athens, and so that was the way that Plato kept paid the bills, so to speak, for the Academy. But in the process, Plato then had space to delve into all kinds of questions of philosophy. He did this through writing dialogues featuring Socrates as the main character. And so in these dialogues, Socrates engages other people in conversation, runs them through this whole ringer of questions, and they are finally able to arrive at some conclusions about things, though the Platonic dialogues are never fully settled on any question, I think. But Plato does offer a lot of opinions, and one of the great questions to debate, I suppose, is how much of this is authentically Socrates and how much of this is Plato speaking with the mouthpiece of Socrates, or rather using Socrates as a kind of mouthpiece to voice his ideas. Now, we could spend an entire semester on Plato alone. Not going to try to characterize all of his philosophy. I do want to make 2 points, and these are by way of comparison with Aristotle, who is his most important follower, his most important pupil. For Plato, ultimate reality is found in something he calls the forms. Forms are not physical, not corporeal. They're not something that you can sense or touch or taste or see or hear. Rather, they exist more in the realm of ideas. They are principles, as it were. And all physical manifestations of things are but reflections of the form, which contains within its idea all of the examples that one sees of things. Now, I probably just lost a lot of you in that. Okay, I don't mean to be opaque in describing this, but for Plato, the important realm is the realm of ideas. And so he didn't concern himself with doing experiments on physical things. Rather, he was what we call a rationalist. He spent his time in the realm of ideas, and through those thoughts, he was able to arrive at this understanding of the forms or of principles that govern all other things. Now, Aristotle, on the other hand, goes in the opposite direction. For Aristotle, the reality is found in what he calls the substance. That is, the individual physical thing which should be observed and experimented on. And the experimenter should then write down his or her observations. And from this experimentation and observation, one eventually arrives at principles. And so you start with the substance. Now, I've just described here 2 very important processes. Plato is the father of deduction, and we might even use the simple term mathematics. Right? If you consider mathematics, they start with these principles that you cannot actually see. There is no kind of perfect case study for any of these things, but they're principles that we apply to individual cases. And so, take geometry for instance. We would say that the sum of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees, or two parallel lines will continue along forever and never intersect, never get closer together or further apart. Now, there is no physical instance of two parallel lines going on forever anywhere in the universe. Rather, it's a principle. It exists in the realm of ideas, and we cannot make sense of anything else of any other mathematical things without accepting principles like that. And we use those things to deduce in the case studies, as it were. Okay. Aristotle is the father of induction. That is, the gathering of information and placing it into its proper categories, arriving at nomenclature and taxonomy, and so, systems of categorization and things like this. In other words, Aristotle functions very much like a scientist and uses a form of the scientific method to arrive at truth, right? Aristotle is also the father of Western logic, and he came up specifically with the notion of syllogistic logic, which is about putting things in categories. A simple syllogism that Aristotle himself used is all human beings are mortal. So we have this category of human beings, and it is coterminous with the term mortal, right? Or rather, mortal is a category into which all human beings fit. So that's the first premise of the syllogism. The second premise is Socrates, and he just pulls out, a famous name here. Socrates is a human being. So we have this single case of a human being, and then the conclusion that he can draw from those two premises is, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Because all human beings are mortal, and Socrates is a human being, then Socrates is mortal. Right? That is a simple syllogism. And I encourage all of my students to take a logic class. You will, I think, see the world in much more productive ways if you do. Now, just to give you a couple of examples here in conclusion about Plato and Aristotle. One of Plato's most famous dialogues is called the Republic, and probably the most famous part of the Republic is the so-called cave allegory. And this is a commentary really on philosophers, on reality, on the process of obtaining reality, right? And some of you may be familiar with this, but let me recount it very briefly. Plato says the world is like a cave, or rather, it is a cave. We're using a metaphor here, all right, not a simile. So the world is a cave, and all of the inhabitants of the earth are chained up in the cave, staring at the back wall of the cave. They are chained and fixed in place so that they cannot move, they cannot turn their heads. They can only look at the back wall, and that is all they have ever looked at. Now, there's a fire burning behind them. They don't know it's a fire. They don't really know what a fire is, but it's burning behind them, and it's casting shadows on the back wall of the cave, and they're looking at these shadows, and because this is their only experience, says Plato, that is what they think reality is. Reality consists of the shadow puppets on the wall, right? But is that reality? Well, Plato says, of course not. The fire is far more real, but they don't know it's a fire. Well, then Plato says, okay, what if one person gets unchained and turns around and looks at the fire? What would be their response? Well, their initial response would be pain, discomfort, disorientation. They're going to be confused, not know what's going on. But if they endure and look at the fire for long enough, their eyes will eventually adjust, and they will see that the shadow puppets they've been looking at on the wall are actually a reflection of a greater reality. Now, the fire is not the ultimate reality, of course. Plato says for that you got to get out of the cave, and so again, the person is, dragged kicking and screaming out of the cave into the broad daylight, and their initial response, and you can probably identify this for anyone who has ever, been in a dark room and then walked out into the sunshine. It's quite painful. That's going to be the same response here. They're going to want to go back in the cave, but if they're in place long enough and hold their position, they will eventually adjust, and they will see that the world is much different than what they had envisioned when they were chained up looking at shadow puppets, right? That this reality is far greater than what they had considered to be reality before, right? Now, that's Plato really talking about the forms versus the kind of sensory data that we think is reality. But this is also commentary on philosophers. Because Plato says, okay, the responsibility of the person who has been outside of the cave and has learned what reality is not to hang out there and bask in their newfound knowledge. It's rather to go back in the cave and to try to unchain people and get them to see reality. Now, Plato acknowledges that the likely response that these people are going to have is not going to be friendly. They're not going to appreciate this. They might even turn violent, as they did with Socrates. But it is still the responsibility of the philosopher to do that. Plato says that the ultimate society, this really is the point of the Republic, is to talk about the ultimate kind of society. The ultimate society would be ruled by philosopher kings. That is, people who understand reality ought to have the power. Now, he says that's not really practical. I know what happens to philosophers. I saw it happen to Socrates. But nevertheless, he thinks that that's the way things should be if people were really wise. Okay, now just very briefly with Aristotle. This is from one of his works on ethics. It's called the Nichomachaean Ethics. And notice the process here of placing things into categories, right? So he starts by saying every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit. So anything that human beings do, in other words, is thought to aim at some good. We don't do things just randomly. We don't participate in random behavior. We do something because we think that something good is going to come of it, right? So, for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. Okay. However, there are different goals that people have in mind, and so he needs to categorize those. Some ends are activities, others are products apart from the activities that produce them, and so, we need to come up with these categories, he says, for understanding human behavior. Now, I'm not going to go on here. Aristotle is not an easy read. I think he's probably a pretty good cure for insomnia. If you have trouble sleeping, pick up a copy of Aristotle. He'll probably put you to sleep pretty quickly. But this whole process of categorizing, creating taxonomies, is intrinsic to the Western intellectual tradition. And Aristotle is really kind of the first one who comes up with it. So keep all of that in mind, and we're going to look at the influence of Plato and Aristotle on later thinkers a bit as we go on in the course here. Okay. All right. In the next discussion, I'm going to stop here, but I'm going to start by talking about Greek art and architecture, which is, of course, another tremendously important contribution that they make to Western civilization. So in this discussion, we've talked about different kinds of genres of texts, written evidence that the Greeks produced, and hopefully you are now well equipped to write a paper on Euripides. Again, if you have questions or comments, please address them in the discussion board. Thank you.